Hello. The purpose of this video is to review one of the theories that was discussed in chapter 9. This chapter was entitled Social Reaction and Critical Models of Crime. But the theory that we're going to discuss is the social reaction theory, which is essentially just a name for labeling theory. The labeling theory has several basic assumptions that are made. The first assumption that's made by labeling theory is that individual self-concept or how people view themselves is influenced by how others react to them. If others react to them positively, then people will believe or view themselves as being positive people. If people, on the other hand, react to individuals negatively, then those individuals will perceive themselves or view themselves in a negative light. A follow-up assumption to this is that individuals become criminal not because of their actions, but because of decisions made by others in positions of government, especially the criminal justice system. And so instead of analyzing individuals' behaviors as they stand alone, this perception or this theory analyzes the way that people in power, particularly the criminal justice system, respond to people. And they identify that it's the criminal justice response to people and how the criminal justice system treats and stigmatizes people that actually creates criminal behavior. Labeling theory makes several arguments. First argument is that identity, or how people view themselves, is highly influenced by the way that society categorizes individuals. We know that in our society, people who commit criminal offenses are labeled as deviant and pathological. And as a result of that, then, according to labeling theorists, this creates what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy, whereby people begin to take on the labels that that have been forced upon them, and then they begin to accept those labels and act out in ways that support those labels. Therefore, labeling theory argues labels make offenders perform the role that they have been assigned. If you call me a thief, I'm going to steal. If you call me violent, I'm going to engage in violent behavior. If you say that I am delinquent, then I'm going to also behave in delinquent ways. The key concept then in labeling theory is this idea of stigmatization. Stigmatization is just another way of saying that people have been labeled in a negative way. And as a result of that, everyone begins to see those people in that way. Several people have contributed to the development of the labeling theory. Tannenbaum, for example, spoke about the dramatization of evil. The dramatization of evil is what occurs when youth are caught and labeled after their first offense. So if a youth, for example, breaks into a home, instead of that being looked at as this kid is just being a normal kid who engages in deviant or mischievous behavior, according to Tannenbaum, society tends to dramatize that evil, which means that they tend to embellish that evil. And not only do they embellish the actual behavior, but then they start to label the child themselves as being problematic. So it's not just that the act itself was evil, but that the individual who engaged in the act as well should also be labeled as evil. Another person who also contributed to the labeling perspective is Lemert. Lemert argued that social control caused deviance, not that deviance caused social control. According to Lemert, there are two types of deviance, primary and secondary deviance. Primary deviance is occasional deviant behavior. It's the normal to be expected deviant behavior, particularly when we're talking about children that is grounded in general situations. So, for example, children tend to explore when they're young. They tend to engage in thrill-seeking behaviors when they're young. That is a function of being young. According to Lemert, primary deviance is not a problem. As a matter of fact, again, as I said before, primary deviance is to be expected. So, for example, a child who drinks alcohol, well, a child or a minor who drinks alcohol is automatically engaging in deviant or illegal behavior based on their age. But according to Lemert, this primary deviance is to be expected because that's what children do. They explore the world around them. Sometimes doing so, they engage in behaviors that are either deviant or criminal. However, Lemert also says that there's a second form of deviance called secondary deviance. And this secondary deviance receives severe social reactions to repeated primary deviance. So, for example, the child who experiments with alcohol and drugs at a young age out of curiosity, well, society can sometimes react in ways that are harsh and overly severe for that type of explorative behavior. And as a result of that, according to Lemert, sometimes what will happen is that children who have been labeled because they engaged in primary deviance will accept those labels of being deviant and criminal and start to act out in ways that are much more severe than the usual exploratory or experimental type of deviance. This new type of deviance, again, that is more severe and more frequent, is what Lemert called secondary deviance. And secondary deviance, according to Lemert, is a reaction to being labeled harshly for engaging in primary deviance. So overall, the argument that is made by labeling theorists then is that when the criminal justice system comes into contact with people who engage in primary deviance and they label those individuals as deviant or criminal, the entire society responds by also labeling those individuals as deviant and criminal. And because of that, the person who's been labeled as such will begin to accept those labels, internalize those labels, and then also begin to act out in ways that are much more severe than they initially did. And this is where crime comes from, according to Lemert and other labeling theorists. So the criminal justice system's interventions or labeling of people as criminal and deviant is a problem. What policy implications do we have? Well, according to your chapter, there are 3 different policy implications. Diversion, which involves trying to get cases out of the formal justice system as soon as possible. We know that sometimes when offenders are arrested, they're usually funneled through the criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system. But there are diversion programs that are designed particularly for getting people out of the juvenile justice system or the adult system with a record or a label. Then there's decriminalization, which refers to reducing the criminality of certain illegal activities. And we've seen a lot of that in recent years. So, for example, in some places, prostitution has been legalized. In other places, we know that marijuana has been legalized. By taking the criminal label out of some certain behaviors, that is a form of getting rid of the criminal justice system in people's lives and also reducing the amount of stigmatization and labeling happening. And then finally, the last policy implication associated with labeling theory is deinstitutionalization, which means keeping relatively minor, often first-time offenders from experiencing the ordeals of incarceration. Research has confirmed that being incarcerated oftentimes takes minor offenders and first-time offenders and makes them worse offenders. And so by institutionalizing minor offenders and first-time offenders, labeling theorists argue that this will also reduce secondary deviance. Those are the main ideas that were discussed in this chapter regarding labeling theory. Please read over this chapter and become familiar with it for yourself.